Thanks very much, Tom, and compliments to you and your team for organising this week. It's part of a bigger picture effort at USP, which is related to sort of general movement in the space worldwide, as Tom mentioned. This is not exactly restricted here; it's quite widespread. But it's also alluded to in the current strategic plan and will be more detailed in the new strategic plan, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. When I first came here, then one of the things that struck me about the Pacific was, and this is not news to anyone in this room probably, was how low the participation rate is in higher education right across the region. Even Fiji, which is sort of in better shape than most, is somewhere around sort of 11 to 12%. It's hard to get exact figures on these things. Solomon Islands, when we put together the Solomon Islands academic plan, it's about 4%. Compared with sort of figures in most Western countries, our neighbours are typically in the range of sort of 40, 50, 60% type thing, and higher education generally not purely universities. So the notion of open education is something that's got quite a bit of currency worldwide in a way that is driven by a perception by many, including governments, that the traditional model provision of higher education is not really scalable to the types of levels that people actually want. You just find it incredibly difficult to resource these things. I can remember when I first went to university in New Zealand, then in those days in New Zealand, similar sort of figures, 3 to 5% of people went to university, and it was all fully funded. They were the good old days, the glory days, when everyone pretty much got a scholarship. And then, so when they're looking at the massification of education in Western countries at that time, then they brought in the loan schemes. It was the only way they could see to fund it. So the notion was that somebody who gained a degree was going to be better off, and therefore it was reasonable that they should expect to pay at least some part of that rather than have it wholly funded by the government, and so on. And so that era is really about funding, whereas in the modern era, it sort of coincided with moves. And again, this is not news to anyone here, where we've moved into a much more digital space. And so we've moved away from the traditional model I had when I went to high school and to university, where even at university we were very driven by textbooks. Every science student had a big fat chemistry textbook and a big fat biology textbook and physics textbook. There were 1,000 pages of massive textbooks. That's what everyone did. You learned bits of the textbook more or less. So the notion of sort of open resources and digitisation of learning materials had moved away from that type of model, which was very sort of pedagogically unsound in the sense that it was really about regurgitation. And I can remember, I've told this in some other forums, that when I finished my honours degree in chemistry, and I got an A+ for a paper in structural chemistry involving X-ray crystallography. So one would think I knew something about X-ray crystallography, and when I first went to do an X-ray crystal structure units technique, I didn't have a clue at all. So I'd learnt the text and the material and the content because it was driven by the notion of a physical hard copy resource that you didn't much engage with. You tended to parrot learn that, and then at the exams, then you spat it all out again, and you got a high mark, and off you went, and people thought you knew something. And as I found to my horror, when I actually had to do some research in chemistry using this particular technique, I didn't actually know how to do it. So the digital revolution has moved us away from purely access to content, but also to the capacity to engage with that content in much more meaningful and much more valuable ways as well. So the university, as I say, is sort of skirted around this area. Part of the original conversation around it came through from some of the student forums, both in the open forums we have here, like the one we had yesterday, and in various forums and at council and other places where the students complained about the cost of textbooks. And if you look at the cost of the textbooks, I can remember looking at some details from, I think, FSTE, where the textbooks, I think prescribed rather than even recommended for one course were totaled up about $1,000. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the students, even those on scholarships, are not going to spend $1,000 on textbooks for a course. And that was linked also to, if you looked at the course outlines, I'm not talking about that example specifically, but you look at a lot of the course outlines, then sort of the learning objectives relate to the textbook chapters. And so it really sort of gives you a sense that the pedagogy sitting under there is rooted in the past, the notion of content regurgitation as well. So whilst we started off thinking about ways we could provide resources for students that didn't cost them thousands of dollars. We started with an open textbook thing. Can we have a open textbook or resource to replace the textbooks? So while we started with that from a sort of cost point of view, then it broadened into a bigger picture discussion around the notion of the fact that we want to have greater use of the tools than purely a digital form of hard copy content as well. So if you look at something like the tablet project, when we had conversations about that, we're saying, well, what do you want here? Is this an e-book reader? You're just regenerating content here, or are you going to use it in a way using Moodle and the various features of Moodle to try and make it more usable? So from those sorts of discussions and batting ideas around and various technology rolled out, then we morphed into a broader picture. And then when PVC Prof. Naidu came here, then he was very quick off the mark to develop an OER policy, resources policy, and a flexible learning policy to try and give us some sort of strategic direction, some underpinning of our thinking about what we're actually trying to do here. Because we could just fairly quickly roll out a bunch of resources, but how did that really fit into the bigger picture? If you look at the current SP, it's quite hard to know whether you achieved something, in my opinion, anyhow, because it has very broad objectives. We will use innovative pedagogy. Well, what does that mean? And how do you know when you've done that, or when you haven't done it, what else you need to do in order to say that you've done that? So I'm quite a fan of policies and frameworks and things which spell out, they interpret those broader picture ideas, which are good ideas, and get them down into something a bit more nitty-gritty that we can get our teeth into, and we can then sort of decide, well, okay, this is what we mean by that, and this is how we can then go about trying to do something, and then evaluate whether that's been successful or not as well. So I think the development of the OER policy and the flexible learning policy together are very valuable scene-setting activities for us to ensure that we know what we're doing going forward. So we will, as Prof. Naidu mentioned, launch the OER repositories straight after I'll do my introductory remarks here as well. But what has happened in the interim, moving forward from the OER policy and the flexible learning policy, is in addition to things like the launch into this week as well, is that we successfully managed to scrabble some money out of SMT to get these grants for OER course conversions. And the reason for this was to try and, again, get a bit of structure and order and do that in a very measured and strategic fashion, as opposed to just sort of randomly going around and doing that. And when you try and get money at SMT, you've got to make a case that they find convincing that particularly links to the strategic plan. And having the policy and the framework behind this flexible learning policy, that helped us to make that case that it fitted in with what the broad objectives of it was. So in that process then, there was 25 projects done, and I particularly liked the model that CFL used here to try and get us into a position where when we developed these resources, they're developed working with experts from CFL and experts from the faculties, because what we found and what everyone would know is that if you leave it to students, then they're not going to buy the textbooks for $1,000. They're typically, even if they have textbooks, often because they're digitally oriented, they want to jump on Google or whatever and find stuff there, then they're doing that anyhow. So they're engaging in the use of OER themselves. It's just that no one is sort of at home to ensure that the materials they gather from that are suited for purpose, that they are of high quality, and that they will help them to learn. In fact, many times if they get the wrong stuff, they can inhibit their learning and set them backwards as well. So the notion of having this money, having the framework set up through the policies, and then having the projects which we then can see through to completion, I think it's a very, very positive mood and very, very good steer it's given to the university to move in the right direction on this as well. We have also, in the more open space rather than resources for linking into our credit-bearing courses, developed a number of MOOCs. We've developed 3 MOOCs in the area of climate change and Pacific studies, and we've signalled in the new strategic plan, which has not yet been approved, might add, but that we want to be more strategic about the use of MOOCs. Hasmukh Lal and Diraj Batu and I went to a conference in UNESCO in Paris a couple of years ago, and it was quite interesting to see how the discourse around MOOCs had changed. I can remember when I was at Waikato University about 10 or 12 years ago, then our VC at the time heard about MOOCs. He thought this was great. He heard these numbers of hundreds of thousands of people enrolling in MOOCs. This is fantastic, big numbers, and we wanted to grow. And when he sort of found out they didn't pay anything, he lost interest in it pretty quickly. And so he sort of missed the point that that whole open movement was a lot about social justice, a lot about expanding education to others who weren't going to get it in the way that I mentioned when I first started this talk this morning. So it's the MOOCs, but what happened I remember the guy, the keynote that opened the conference, the UNESCO conference, he said something along the lines. He read out one of these classic statements, most of you probably heard it. I haven't got the wording exactly right, but this is essentially what he said, is that whole thing about the days of the bricks and mortar universities are over type thing, because everyone's going to be sitting at home on their tablets and universities will cease to exist because you can get everything on the internet and so on. And then he said at the end, he sort of looked around the room and said, well, that didn't happen, did it? And he's right. And so there's a bit of momentum, there's a bit of inertia around the bricks and mortar institutions. But nonetheless, most bricks and mortar institutions have moved more into the digital space, and a lot of them are into MOOCs. But what came out of that conference, one of my learnings in that conference was about how people had shifted away from the notion of seeing MOOCs as some sort of threat that would put us all out of business, was that how we might then actually use MOOCs in a way that is helpful to society and the open notion of it, and at the same time how we could use it to help us, and in a sense that, and that's what's signalled in the new SP, which if it's approved will drive a future direction. So part of the thinking there is to allow USP to provide free resources and education to people about areas in which it believes it has a contribution to make to the broader Pacific society, and then climate change and Pacific studies are classic examples of that. So we sort of did those a bit accidentally, if you like. What we're trying to do in the new USP is signal that we're going to move in a much more strategic direction. So things like marine science and other things might well come into that equation when we sit down and work with the faculties as to what that might mean in the areas. And what they said at the UNESCO conference was that there's a combination of largesse and social responsibility here. At the same time, you raise your profile or raise your reputation, and you allow second chance learners at no cost or risk to themselves to engage in education and think, gee, okay, well, this might work for me. And then if it's in areas that you're expert in, then you can potentially draw those people into further study later on because they've already re-engaged with education, higher education, after having been absent from it for a variety of reasons for some period of time. And that sort of brings me sort of towards the end to sort of link it to our Learning and Teaching Forum last year. Where the next sort of phase of this is the Open Education OER University that Wayne McIntosh talked about as well, of which USP is a member university as well. So the next phase of this is going to move more into the space of how do we then credential some of those qualifications. If people do MOOCs, if they do other learning, then how do we capture that in a way that doesn't sort of put us out of business, but at the same time allows people who have gained knowledge and skills through open resources and OERU to then gain credit for that and then engage in higher education, preferably with us. And so Wayne painted a very nice picture of how to do that, and there'll be an email going out on Tukutuku probably today or tomorrow, which is talking about some of the courses that the OERU is offering that are able to be credited as well. So that's part of that area. And I think that's the next phase where USP needs to move into that, because I think if you look at the Pacific, then all member countries of USP and others that are peripheral to us have that same problem. How do we scale up higher education in a way that we want without bankrupting us, because they've got a lot of demands on their budgets for health and infrastructure and so on as well. So I think that's part of the bigger picture as to where we're going here. So I think USP's moved a lot in the last 12 months from where we were skirting on the edges of it. We now have our policies, we have our framework which sets the scene of how we want to operate more strategically in this space. We've got some good runs on the board in terms of 3 very successful MOOCs with thousands of students registering for them. And then we have these 25 OER projects as well. So then we want to claim the space, we want to move further in the space, we want to integrate it with the school system. There's obviously a lot of interest in things going on in the school system around more digitised, more mobile, more open learning in the schools as well. we want to provide the leadership that the member countries of USP expect us to do. And so I commend Simon and his team for driving